we in the past years have seen tremendous efforts in advancing this approach in the humanitarian sector. A lot of great work has been done in terms of getting ahead of climatic shocks such as typhoons, droughts, floods, and so on. But today we've seen less efforts and progress when it comes to working on anticipatory action in conflict settings, and also on conflict as a shock in itself. So what we want to do today is to essentially look a bit at what is the current state of predicting or forecasting conflict and displacement, and what are some of the opportunities, limitations, and lessons learned, and so on, for using these tools for anticipatory action approaches. So we have a great lineup of speakers, and I'll hand over the floor in just a second. But before that, I do just a few housekeeping rules. So we'll have 5 presentations, short presentations, and we should have some time in the end for questions. So if you have any questions during the session, please just feel free to write them in the chat, or if you want, you can also write them on a piece of paper and then raise your hand when we get to the end of the session, where we'll have open up the floor. You're also welcome to introduce yourself in the chat. So let us know where you're calling in from, and your background and affiliations, so we know a bit more who's in the virtual room today. I'm currently just dropping out of a vacation, so in Zanzibar, and Zanzibar doesn't have the most stable internet in the world. So I hope it stays with us for this hour. But in case there are any issues, I also have a colleague here on the call who will jump in on my behalf. So I think with that, I will hand over the floor to our first speaker today. And we have Katayun, and I hope that I pronounced your name correctly, Katayun Kishi, who's the head of data science at ACLED, that will introduce and tell us more about their tool for forecasting conflict. So I will hand it over to you now and go to the first slide. If it works here, yes.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm Katayun Kishi, head of data science with ACLED, and I wanted to talk with you a bit about our prediction model, the conflict alert system. Can I click through, or you have to click through? I'll just say next slide to you when I'm ready. So the ACLED CAST, as we call it, conflict alert system, it predicts the number of organized violence events in a month. So by organized violence, we mean battles, explosions, and remote violence, and then violence against civilians. And if anyone's familiar with the ACLED dataset, these are some of our event types that we have in that dataset. Our forecasts are updated every month, and we forecast out 6 months into the future. And so each of those forecasts are available monthly, and then they're updated into the future each time. We also have global coverage, meaning we cover, we make forecasts at the admin 1 level in every country, and then aggregate those up to the country level. So we look at forecasts across the world in every admin 1. In the dashboard, we sort of limit it to admins that have at least 1 event in a month. Next slide. So this is just a snapshot of what our tool looks like. So if you were to go onto our website, the section on early warning and forecasting, you could find the link over to the conflict alert system dashboard from there. And if you were to click into a country, so for example, here we have Iraq, you can see the detailed kind of view for that country. So for example, at the top left, we'll have a snapshot of the forecast out by event type. And then on the right-hand table, you also see those forecasts divided out by specific admin. One thing that we really wanted to emphasize when looking at these forecasts is how is it contextualized within the overall conflict of a country? So if we're predicting 300 events for the next month, is that a huge increase from the norm, or is that pretty much business as usual in that country? So what we've done is set a default to the 12-month average for the country. So you can see the colors corresponding to whether that's a predicted significant increase or decrease, or limited change relative to that 12-month average, but this is also customizable. So if you're looking at a country that has recently broken out into violence, perhaps a 1 or 3 month average comparison would be more useful. Another thing I wanted to highlight here is the bottom trend line that we have. If you look at the tabs there, we have what's driving the forecast. If you go to the next slide, you can see what that would look like. So if you click into that tab, basically we wanted to essentially use explainable AI to look into the black box of what is driving the forecast that we're making. So if we're telling you 39 events will happen in Erbil in October, why are we saying that? What are the sort of driving elements that you as a researcher should be aware of? So essentially what we can see here in the table is we have a baseline prediction for the admin. So that'll be 30 events, for example, and that represents the prediction the model would make if we fed it no other predictors. So if it was just looking at sort of the historical variation in that admin, and we can see the sort of step-by-step fluctuations in the prediction that lead it all the way to the final sort of prediction the model gave us, which is 39 events. So in this case for Erbil, you can see that violence in the neighboring admins in the last month contributed a significant number of events. The number of explosions and remote violence that occurred the previous month actually decreased the prediction, and so on. And this will be different for every admin. We'll highlight sort of the top 4 or 5 predictors in the model that contributed a significant number of events to the end prediction. Next slide. So the last thing I'll talk about with the dashboard itself is we really wanted to emphasize transparency and accuracy as well. So here, the main sort of dashboard screen was what I showed you before, but then you can click over to the accuracy metrics tab, which is what's displayed here, to give you a sense of how accurate is this model. And we'll be the first to tell you that prediction tools and models are not necessarily the best tool for every conflict case. There are some countries and conflicts in which it performs very well. It picks up really well on patterns and does a good job predicting out into the future. And then there's some cases in which the conflict is too fresh, or there's not enough history or information there or variation for us to be able to make a really meaningful prediction. So this gives you a hands-on way of being able to filter in and see what it looks like for each of the cases you're interested in. You can do this by country, by admin. It'll display for you the number of observed events, the default being the average of the last 6 months, but you can also look at specific months if you're interested in those. But it gives you what we forecasted, what actually ended up happening, what was the differential, and what is that differential relative to the number of events that you normally see. So if we're off by 500 events, that could either be a huge number or it could be quite a small number relative to what we normally see in that country. Next slide. So we just hit the 6-month mark of having launched the tool. So we did kind of an internal look at our accuracy metrics and the performance. So I wanted to share a few interesting things that we found. Here we have, this is among sort of high activity countries, so countries that have 20 or more events in a month. You can see that about 75% of those countries, we are predicting within 10% of the actual observed sort of events that occurred. So you can see this includes cases like Nigeria, Brazil, Myanmar, Ukraine, Yemen, Palestine, all really interesting, active, and actually quite diverse conflict cases as well. You have everything from a state versus a state, all the way to, violence against civilian-led violence in terms of gang militias, et cetera. Then we have cases like Syria, Ethiopia, Sudan that are performing not as well as the other cases. So these can be driven by sort of the anomalies that we'll see. So Sudan, for example, that error rate is largely being driven up by the violence that broke out in April. Next slide, please. So here we wanted to take a look at the effect of lead time on the error rate. So, go back one, please. Yeah, so here you see this is sort of showing you when you were looking at a forecast 1 month into the future versus all the way up to 6 months into the future, how does the error rate shift? And you can see across all the various event types that we look at, it's pretty much the same upward trajectory of how the error rates increase. And so this kind of illustrates why we chose 6 months as our cutoff point in terms of providing forecasts. It's a happy medium, I think, between being useful for a practitioner, so it's not too close into the future where there's not enough time to do any meaningful programming or planning, but it's also not so far into the future where the error rates are really starting to deteriorate. Next slide. And then we also took a look at sort of how the model has changed its behavior over time, so to speak. So you can see in the case of Mali, for example, the blue line is the forecasted number of events that we had. The orange line is the observed number. So you can see when the tool launched in March, we were really overestimating or over forecasting the number of events in Mali. And then it sort of quickly started to adjust itself to where now the trend line has sort of started to convene a bit more. If you look, it's a bit of a similar case in Somalia at the bottom of the screen, where we started out over predicting, and now you can really see the trend line closely mirroring the number of observed events that we see there. In Nigeria, the model started out pretty well, actually, like predicting things pretty closely to what we ended up seeing in Nigeria. But then there was a sudden spike in violence in July where we were all of a sudden under forecasting, but then you can see the model quickly corrected itself the following month to provide a more accurate forecast. So it's just kind of an interesting look into how these kind of, it takes a little bit of time and adding and learning from the model to be able to sort of converge its forecast with what we're actually seeing on the ground. One more. So I wanted to really touch quickly on some of our users and the impact. So it's quite soon to be able to really know. It's only, again, been 6 months since we launched. So we've had a lot of interest and a lot of conversations with organizations, but we're still sort of waiting on feedback and some use case examples of this being really a useful tool for people, but we're hopeful. So I won't go into all of these, but this is just a snapshot of the types of users that we know are downloading and using the CAST dashboard. Sort of the frequency of their downloads you can see is quite varied. Some of the feedback that we have gotten is that they're using the tool for sort of their in-house risk assessment dashboards, looking at where to sort of focus their programming efforts, and sort of really feeding into kind of these operational needs that they have, which is really the intention and the hope. So with that, we go to the next slide, please. I can just wrap it up. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have or any feedback or suggestions for how we can modify the tool into the future. Like I said, we're sort of at the 6-month mark now, so we're really taking a minute to assess kind of the direction that we want to go in with it. So looking forward to everyone's thoughts. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Katayun, and really, really impressive work and a great accomplishment already with only 6 months where this tool has been live. And I know it has already, of course, gained a lot of attention and prominence, and just by seeing also the use cases, it's really impressive. So thank you very much for giving us some insights into also how the tool works and the black box. Now I will hand it over to Seth Caldwell, who is a data scientist at the predictive analytics team in the Center for Humanitarian Data. Let me see if I can just put you on here. Yes, the floor is yours, Seth.
Amazing, thank you. Yeah, you can already proceed with the next slide, but I'm here to talk about conflict prediction and the work we've done to try and assess the feasibility of using conflict prediction for anticipatory humanitarian action. So I've left a few transitions in the slide, so you can click twice here and we'll just have the full slide up and available. But essentially, if you just go next twice, thanks. We have a wide array of anticipatory action portfolios from the OCHA side, exactly as Alexander laid out in the beginning of this call. That the primary work we've done since 2018 as we started to explore anticipatory action has been looking almost exclusively at climatic shocks alongside some work on epidemics. And we have now a portfolio of over 12, maybe 14 countries now, and still growing, where we've been working on these climatic shocks and WFP, FAO, IFRC, other kind of large-scale actors, and I know there's many more from the START network and other organizations working on anticipatory action, are also primarily focused on these climate shocks. But if you go to the next slide, And then, yeah, you can go next twice again for my thanks. Do you think that there's a really key imperative to do this work on conflict? Obviously, we're on this call because this is, really, really important. But if you look at, the narratives that's been going on about the ongoing climate emergency, which is extremely dire, as we know, but if you look at funding that's been going to humanitarian response since 2015, it's been significantly growing as needs and the work that we need to do as a humanitarian community grow. But the proportion of funding going to shocks that are crises solely driven by conflict, and crises that are driven by conflict and maybe some other variables like climate, epidemics, or other variables remains constant. So it's not that we're seeing, a significant driver of extreme need and human suffering in areas solely affected by climate shocks. It really seems to be the interlinkages between conflict and these other kind of shocks that are driving the vast majority of humanitarian action. And in the next graph on the right, really these large-scale humanitarian emergencies, those that have a permanent presence of the UN and have a humanitarian coordinator and response plan. These are the ones almost exclusively that see extreme protracted conflict over the past 10 years and exhibit the most severe conditions as measured by Inform. So if you go to the next slide, I mean, that's just a layout. This is what we were coming into when we wanted to say, look, can we do this for conflict, because there's an extreme need there. And I think if you go to the next slide, quite simply, we thought at the moment, we don't see performance in a way that is feasible. And very clearly, we don't think that conflict predictions are operational for anticipatory action. We've reviewed kind of an array of evidence from the academic space that looking at performance metrics and how conflict prediction models perform. And unlike those that are working on climate shocks, where the models have been improving, gradually since the 80s, and there's a large kind of robust academic science that's been pushing this space forward, we don't see the performance there. And primarily, our findings were that essentially, predicting onset is an extremely difficult, in escalation is an extremely difficult task, and that's where a lot of value comes in. And predicting the humanitarian impact of conflict is missing. And that's really the key piece that anticipatory action requires, because we have a pre-designed operational plan off of these models that requires kind of a clear threshold and trigger without a human in the loop to ensure that the speed is of the response is moving forward quickly. So it's different from a risk analysis or preparedness. We really need a model, kind of a model based, or it can have humans, in there, but fully validated like a model to show that they can predict conflicts and the humanitarian impacts. And we don't think that's there. And if you just look, this is a recent paper from this year, a kind of review of conflict early warning systems. I think if you look at actually how the visuals of conflict predictions and forecasts from early warning systems, this is a set of 3 in the kind of colored bands, with the black lines being the observed conflict. You can see that the early warning systems are extremely flat. And, we think this is just emblematic that even looking at the performance metrics, you don't get the full story, that actually what's being output by these models we don't think are necessarily useful and applicable, especially when we're looking for those changes or intensifications that would give us new knowledge beyond just already looking at what's happened. So if you go to the final slide, we do think, there's a way forward. And, this is, number one, we really want to emphasize the gap in the prediction of conflict, the impacts of conflict, like displacement, which I think we're going to have some speakers on. Which can be more effective than predicting conflict itself, and doesn't necessarily require conflict prediction. You could predict the impacts off of observed conflict, which is something we do for yield forecasting in the drought space, for instance. And, people are moving in this space. The VIEWS team for Violence and Early Warning System is now the Violence and Impacts of Conflict Early Warning System. So there's a shift in the academic sector where hopefully this work is happening. And so we should actively engage with this community to ensure that the predictions of impact fit our needs as practitioners and as humanitarians. And, in our paper, we didn't say that, there's no path forward for doing, conflict anticipatory action, but if there's anything in the moment, it's definitely going to require a significant amount of transparency, because we think the model's performance, we should have transparency in all of our work, which is something we emphasize in our anticipatory action pilot. But I think it's especially key when the performance of models are so poor in this space. So if you're trying something with humans in the loop, field experts, or other approaches, we should make sure that all of the models that we build or the models we apply are open, transparent, and publicly validated to prove there's value there, and that the work that we're doing is, you know, really best serving those that are receiving the aid that we're trying to help. So I'll stop there, and looking forward to hear the rest of the speakers. And thanks to Katjun for the first chat there, and Alexander for hosting.
Thank you very much, Seth, for those very useful insights, and of course also for producing the sort of the seminal work around the paper that really has framed a lot of these discussions the last year on conflict prediction and for anticipatory action. And I think there's a lot of good also elements in the report and in your presentation today, also on what are some of the gaps, and especially of course the way forward and how we can bring this to the front. So I think with that, we will go to our third speaker, which is Isabel Ardon, the Director of Research at the International Crisis Group. And yeah, your slides here. So the floor is yours, Isabel.
Thank you. I'm just going to, sorry, I'm trying to see the slide. Just a second. Yes. Okay. All good. So hello everyone. I'm very happy to be with you all today. I think it's indeed a very important discussion. So I'm going to present some of the work we've been doing on early warning at the International Crisis Group. I'm Isabel Ardon, as was said, the Director for Research. I'm based in Brussels. So first I'm going to present Crisis Watch. So that's the next slide. Crisis Watch is the global conflict tracker of the International Crisis Group, also an early warning bulletin that has been in place since September 2003. So it's been 20 years, so we have a long record of tracking conflict. It's now covering about 70 situations of conflict, potential conflict, and vulnerable states. It provides an update on all of those every month at the beginning of the month. And as you can see with this map, we also monitor another 40, 50 situations every month. But we only provide updates in case there is an actual escalation or shift in the situation. The focus is on overall political and security developments, and that's quite important. We don't automatically capture everything. That's always through the prism of political and security developments. We offer assessments on a month-to-month basis, checking how an overall political and security situation has improved, deteriorated, or remained the same. So as you can see on this map, you can see deteriorated situation, for example, in Mali, Burkina Faso, Pakistan in dark red. And you can see improved situation for Western Sahara for the month of September. We also look at conflict risks alerts and conflict resolution opportunities for the coming months being singular. And here you have a conflict resolution opportunity we have a conflict risk alert for Kosovo, but no conflict resolution opportunity for this month. We have introduced a number of innovations in recent years in order to make Crisis Watch more accessible to the general public. In particular, now all our updates have in the bolded line in a summary of our assessments, as well as in the entire entry, a breakdown of the various conflict trends that we are following. And I'm going to discuss that in more depth. Looking at the next slide, please. So I was advised to look at those cases basically that have been hard to predict. So there might be better cases where maybe Crisis Watch has been more useful, but regardless, I think it's good to see how a tracker that is relying on qualitative information is performing and how it can be of use. So here, looking at Ukraine, I think what's quite interesting is that we had a number of conflict risk alerts, and you can see at the top with a bar, a few months before the Russian invasion of Ukraine in late February 2022. For the Crisis Watch November 2021, released in early December 2021, we said there were concerns of potential invasion and renewed armed conflict in the East. And of course, this is something we repeated again.
I think we lost you, Isabel, the sound, or it's just me? Just give Isabel a minute. The rest of you can take a sip of coffee or write your questions in the chat.
Is it working?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, sorry about that. So I don't know where I left you, but well, basically overall for Ukraine, we raised our concerns as far back as 2.5 months before the Russian invasion. And of course, it's got to be read in coordination with the analytical reports that we do. So the next slide. Yes, then looking at Sudan, here you can see the sort of breakdown I was talking about earlier. We have in the bolded line the summary of our assessments, and then the sort of conflict trends that we follow for each country or conflict we monitor. In the case of Sudan and the escalation in April 2023, I thought that was quite interesting because, of course, if you look at the Crisis Watch, we actually had a side for March 2023. So it looks like we didn't predict the actual escalation of April, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. And there lies a challenge, because if you go deeper into the entry, you see that we did raise the fact that tensions between the military leaders reached worrying heights. And equally, one of the elements we were tracking very carefully was the tensions between Burhan and Hemeti. And we did say that they spiked then, and we highlighted the issue of fears of civil war in our entry. But the reason we couldn't assign a down arrow back in March, which would of course have alerted people maybe in a better way, is that we look at the way overall political and security developments compared to the previous months have deteriorated. So it's an overall assessment. And things sometimes balance each other. And what happened in this case is that Burhan and Hemeti had this meeting in Khartoum where they agreed to de-escalate tensions. And so we had to take that into consideration as well. Next slide. So here it's Burkina Faso 2019, also a case study I was encouraged to highlight. And I mean, of course, we're all aware it's been extremely worrying, the situation in Burkina Faso in relation to displacement. We've seen the numbers really increasing. I thought that was quite interesting to note that in 2018, we had 3 down arrows, and in 2019, 7 down arrows. If you look at the actual issues that we raise, it's a lot around tit-for-tat attacks between jihadist forces and security forces, and also a lot of abuses by the security forces against civilians, and all of that fueling more and more escalatory violence. Next slide. And here it's Myanmar. I think this one is also interesting in the sense that I was asked to look at Rohingya displacement 2017. We have a down arrow then, and it's related to the escalation in northern Rakhine State when ARSA launched coordinated attacks on 30 police posts. And then the military subsequently conducted clearance operations. I mean, if you look at the bar above, it's all with sides. But actually, if you go deeper again in the entry, you can see that tensions had been on the rise ahead of the attack, with several incidents suggesting increased ARSA activity, but also deployment of additional Myanmar troops, etc. And then if you go back into the regular conflict trends from Crisis Watch, you can see how things are building up. But of course, sometimes monthly tracking can mix some of these subtle shift. Next slide. And I think that leads me to the innovation we've introduced in relation to Crisis Watch, because like everyone else, we're aware of the strengths, but also the limitations as regards predictions of violent conflict. In our case, it's really good at monitoring monthly conflict shift, but of course we want sometimes to have a longer line of prediction. And so we introduced conflict in focus recently. In this case, it's looking at Nagorno-Karabakh. And we have a section called What to Watch in the next 3 to 6 months. And in this case, we highlight 2 elements. One, the fact that the border between Armenia and Azerbaijan remains a potential flashpoint. And second, that the mass influx of displaced people into Armenia will pose serious challenges for authorities in the coming months and beyond. Next. And I want to finish with this new product that we've actually launched today called On the Horizon. It's on the back of meetings we've been having actually for a number of years, but in a confidential manner, building on Crisis Watch and trying to refine our predictions in the next 3 to 6 months. We are able for the first time to share with you the result of some of these meetings we've been having on the back of Crisis Watch. And here it's focusing on 4 case studies: DRC, Ethiopia, Somaliland, and Bangladesh. The information again focuses on the period until March 2024. So if you look at the next slide, it's what's quite interesting, and maybe that differs from some of the models you're doing, is really the strengths of Crisis Group and the work we've been doing, I think, is that we focus very much on actors' behavior. And that is what is the most difficult to predict to some extent. And it's of course what, tends to bring peace or conflict. In relation to On the Horizon, what we're trying to do is to provide detailed information about actors' behavior. So in the case of Ethiopia, you can see we're looking at actors' behavior in particular in relation to Amhara violence. And you can see in the map the situation there in Amhara region. Second, we're trying to put the spotlight on the implementation of the peace process in Tigray and some of the risks associated with that and potential conflict, potential actors' behavior. And lastly, we look at the risk of spreading violence, especially if tensions between Amhara and Oromo communities grow in the future. We also have sections on the potential consequences, which arguably can be useful as regards to what the previous presenter was saying around the impact of conflict to take into account. And I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Isabel. Really, really interesting work. And I think also this new product looks super exciting. And I think, again, as you could see, I gave Isabel a bit of a challenge and asked her, like, would you have been able, or did you to some extent predict some of these? What in our models, the models at least we've been working on, has been unpredictable events like the Burkina Faso crisis, the Sudan crisis, Ukraine, and also the Rohingya crisis. And I think this presentation really showed the value of looking at the qualitative analysis and seeing what is in there, not only just seeing the overall conclusions, but really reading into it and seeing what the scenarios look like when you're doing this type of work and trying to predict the future developments. Now we'll hand it over to Sofia Kiriati, who's an AI engineer at UNHCR, and I will stop sharing my screen so Sofia, she can share her presentation.
Yes, thank you, Alexander. And also, thanks to the previous presentations, I really like the focus on the usability and just like making sure that we predict a couple of months in advance, because that's also really important for our work. And I think you're talking about your work as well at DRC. So basically at the UNHCR Innovation Service, we have also worked on predicting movement. I will talk about 2 specific use cases that we have worked on in the past, and some of them are ongoing and our lessons learned from that. So when we are talking about humanitarian decision-making, we're talking about the process of evaluating and deciding upon a course of action. For us, it's preparedness. For us, it's making sure that we are following the mandate of protection, and we care about the consequences of this decision-making. And that's basically what we, like all of these products, that's what they're facing, the humanitarian decision-making at the end, which comes for like more senior colleagues. So the innovation process is not that different from the innovation process that we will see in a bit that follows the predictive analytics, but definitely we respond to field challenges. So they come, they're demand-driven, and we do check inside to see if we have the capabilities and the skills to respond to those challenges, but then we have to collaborate closely with our colleagues that have the context-related specifics, and then we test and refine the solution with them. We engage with stakeholders. It's a cycle. It goes in iterations. Sorry. Yes. So this is how it looks like. Mostly, it has a lot of coordination. We have definitely. We need to understand the context, so we need those translators, as we call them. We need the team that is based on the ground. They give us the user requirements for such systems, even though they're backed up by more mathematical models. And we also collaborate with other universities, with other organizations, researchers. And that's the end of it. So now we can also base these kinds of like modeling and like support on more larger data sets that we can collect from, as we saw, ACLED is something that we have used a lot in the past. But also satellite imagery for processing. We have a little bit of IoT, some sensors, a lot of our colleagues that bring maybe nodes in different kind of formats, and that's what we have to deal with in order to put together a representation of like a reality for each of these challenges. So we had Project Jetson in Somalia. The situation started in 2010, where like a relatively small population moved then from Somalia to Ethiopia, requiring humanitarian assistance, but then during different phases, 2011, the population went three times that number. And then again, 2018, we had a larger problem to face. So again, this situation is repeating now, where predictive analytics is quite needed for our colleagues to be able to respond better. So the question then from the operation was if we can predict arrivals within a certain amount of time. This was in Somalia. We had our colleague, Rebecca. She went and actually interviewed the people. The response was that people would sell their goats before fleeing a region, and that's the famous goat story. Based on that, we had the proxy for knowing that there will be a big evacuation of that region. We care about data quality. We want it to be technically open, and then it also needs to comply with our policy. So, because we're protecting a lot of the information shared with UNHCR from the people of interest, are the people that are forced to flee. So we care about also having that data in time, but also being able to access it, like parse it and crawl different web pages to collect it. The situation has changed a lot, but at that time, we didn't have access to all of these dashboards with APIs, etc. And so for predicting movement, we divided by the 18 regions in Somalia. We use machine learning models, and we, of course, the way that you do that is to have the temporal element inside the data set. We use climate and conflict data. We use the local market prices and the unique data set that exists in Somalia, the PRMN data set. So there was that effort in the past, and now it's ongoing because the operation there is kind of adopting the solution now that we have access to more, let's say, less, maybe the systems don't require data engineering, but more data science, and that capacity is increasing within the organization a lot. And another project in the Brazil-Venezuela border where it's more different, the context is different, but we had crossings from Venezuela to Brazil in the Pacaraima border. We had our colleagues there that came with a request. The question was if we can see how many people are arriving, how many will require assistance, if we need to expand our camps. And this was a collaboration with UN Global Pulse because they also had the capacity, they had experts on movement and migration. This project was divided into three kind of learning from Project Jetson, where let's say we didn't engage, we didn't see actually the project being adapted by the operation. Here we learned that it would be better to have also a nowcasting aspect to this. So we collected a lot of data around the before image, what was happening when actually the crossings were taking place, and what was happening in Brazil from that side of the border. We did different splits. We cared about even zooming into admin level 2. We used a lot of radio and satellite and Twitter to do qualitative analysis, for example, in some cases, radio and Twitter, to see what was being said at that moment. It was something that the operation asked, maybe also to know how the community is perceiving this movement, but also what is being said on the other side before arriving. And another way also was to just collect data of active users in Facebook. You have these different kinds of proxies that you can use, Google Mobility. And here we're seeing basically how Rebecca was keeping track of these numbers day to day and registering them. Another, the predictions themselves, we had to kind of limit the data sets that we were using so that they had the same structure. And what we wanted to predict was how the situation changed when the border was closing and when COVID appeared. So because like when COVID appeared, after a couple of months, the border closed, and then one side of the border reopened and the other one remained closed. So we had a little bit of change in some variables that were quite relevant to predict the movement. So of course, we wanted to see if this can perform better than a historical mean. But also the predictions were noisy because there is a complex environment there. The regime at the border was changing. And we also realized that it's interesting to show, except for the predictions, also the prediction intervals, like what are the errors that we're taking into account. And how we did is that we supplemented these predictions with the nowcasting that I mentioned before in the simulation. This, you can see a little bit of how the prediction intervals looked like for the different models, since we were trying to predict a couple of months in advance. It was predicting quite well for the past, so we were thinking that the models, an assembly of the models was working quite well. The simulation part was basically just knowing exactly what was taking place during the whole situation. So we had colleagues, for example, that told us that people are waiting at a specific point. They were waiting at the bus stop after they were crossing the border. So we knew a little bit the movement. So there were different points within this whole movement that we could collect data. And we wanted to know from the point that they entered, like depending on how many they needs assistance, how many are planning to stay, or how many are going to be reallocated to a different settlement. We wanted to see if we can simulate this. And we created a simulation. The lines that you see on the horizontal lines are the ones that are different stages. So basically, when at Abrigo there would cross a certain line, it means that you're entering a different phase. And you could kind of work on the simulations on the sidebars to say that in how many days you're expecting this many people to arrive. You have this much capacity to register and this reallocation capacity, and then see how the different camps were moving. Okay, so these are some considerations that we want to put forward as an innovation service, but also as an organization, how to make sure that you are accepting and processing all of these, the challenge in a correct way. So yes, you need to have diversity, integrity on how you're treating the people that are being served through the system, ensure fairness, include those that are at risk, of course, and then also make it open, as we said. I think Olcha's presentation also mentioned this. We are supposed to make these models publicly open so that they can be definitely examined by others. And yes, I think this also is some kinds of recommendations, and is mostly lessons learned from the previous failures that we had. And yeah, I mean, we also like the watchdogs, the ones that observe these systems and are very critical of them. And yeah, just make sure that you include everyone in the team, especially the ones that are more resistant. And I think that's it. Thank you. I hope I didn't take more than 7 minutes, Alexander.
I think you were very much on time. Thank you so much, Sophia, for really interesting presentation, and of course, great work that we also follow a lot in the Danish Refugee Council. And I think I could build a big data set with the amount of times I've talked about your goal story, because I think it really pins down what we should be doing and trying more. We have a few questions. We have 15 minutes left, and I actually also just have a brief presentation on what we are doing in DRC. So I'll just quickly talk you through this, and then we already have a few questions in the chat, and then we are ready to round it up. But yeah, if you have any questions or comments, just it's now you can put it in the chat, and maybe also add if it's for a specific speaker you're asking. Otherwise, I'll try to guess based on your questions. So basically, in the Danish Refugee Council, we have also been working on predicting displacement for an anticipatory action. We've been working on this for around 5 years now. And what we have done is essentially a bit like Sophia has. We've sort of been leveraging open source data to build a machine learning model that can predict future displacement 3 to 4 months into the future at the admin 1 and the admin 2 level in a given country. The model we've developed so far covers Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and we're in the process of building it for South Sudan and Somalia. And we can see when we look at the results from Burkina Faso, where we have more than 300 forecasts at the admin 2 level, we can get an average margin of error down to 15%, which we consider to be a fairly good starting point at least. Like ACLED, we've also built an accessible online user interface where humanitarian actors and others can go in and access the forecast and the dashboard and build their own scenarios and see some of the underlying data and trends. But what we want to do with this now is to use it to inform and build sort of anticipatory action mechanisms. So I'll focus a bit more on that part. So basically what we're looking at is to combine our prediction model with community data for triggering. So here's just again an example from our work in Burkina Faso, where if we essentially set a threshold for doing anticipatory action in response to climate, we have to set a threshold of saying when we have a prediction that 1,200 people are going to be displaced in 3 months' time, we essentially looked at then the historical results and say, okay, how often would we then be acting correctly? So you can see here that in 30% of the time, we would not be acting based on this threshold, which would be correct. And in 32% of the time, the cases, we would act, we would have reached the threshold, we would respond, and that would be correct, because then 3 months later, we would cross that 1,200 people threshold. So in 70% of the cases, we would be acting correctly based on this model. There would still then, of course, be these 30% of the time where we would either be acting in vain because the shock didn't happen, or we would not be acting and the shock would materialize anyway. And of course, that's still a fairly big margin of error, you can say. So we wouldn't solely base any sort of triggering mechanism or anti-action model solely on this model, because it also has some of the same limitations as Seth also mentioned in terms of predicting onset or sort of significant escalation in violence. So one of the things why we want to combine it is with community protection data that we're already collecting in a lot of these communities, and where we can see when we analyze that data that there are a lot of good signals of future conflict and subsequently displacement. So here again, the example is from Burkina Faso, where we ask people continuously to what extent they feel safe moving around in their communities, and we can see that there's actually a quite strong relationship between how safe people feel moving around in their communities, going out and collecting firewoods and so on, and then with the violent events 4 weeks into the later in the future. So this is one of the ways that we want to combine these two and sort of have essentially complementary data sources that goes into the triggering process. But of course, it's not only the ability to predict that's challenging in this aspect. It's also to what can you then actually do when you have this information, even if you're fairly certain that the shock is going to happen. So what we're looking into, and we're setting up now, I'm actually going to South Sudan next week, and we are also setting up Burkina Faso, is to work with the communities in those countries and discuss the type of support that would be relevant for them in advance of future conflict displacement. So of course, we can try to intervene in the place of origin where conflict is happening and driving displacement. We can potentially, provide information to the communities that we're concerned. We can encourage people to obtain documentation and all these type of things. And we can also already start assessing what are the needs, who are the vulnerable groups, and so on. And then the other areas where we're looking at intervening is essentially then when people move, make sure that they have access to support along the way, that we are prepared for those movements. And it's a little bit similar in the host communities, making sure that we are ready to receive an influx of displaced people and provide them with the services and support that they need in a more timely fashion. So this is where we are now. So we are now testing and building this in Burkina Faso and South Sudan over the coming months, and at the same time developing sort of a blueprint for what are the type of anticipatory action responses we see in response to conflict includes displacement. And where we want to go next is essentially to further scale this model and work to more context, but also improve on the modeling side of thing and on the functionalities essentially in the model. So I think I will stop there, and then so we have 6 minutes left and a few questions in the chat. So I'll just quickly take some of them. The first one was from William, and now I need to find it in the chat. He was asking, so what factors go into monitoring a conflict shift? I think this was primarily to Isabel. So if you can maybe start with giving us a few cents, but also I don't know, Katajun, if you have some tricks that you use in ACLED as well on this. So we start with that question.
Yes, I can start. I think this is when we're going into the details of things. I mean, as I said, we track 70 conflict or situations of conflict every month. We have different ways of tracking them because they're all quite different. And so the sort of indicators or criteria will vary. This is why I was explaining in relation to the situations, we now provide a breakdown on a monthly basis of the conflicts we cover. In there, you can see 2 or 3 core issues that we track. And in relation to the conflict shift, you will see 2 different types. what are called the mini conflict shifts. Basically, you can see in relation to the 2 or 3 issues changes, mini deteriorations, mini improvement, or mini stabilization. And then you will see the major conflict shift. Basically, the overall political security situation of that place, improving, deteriorating, or remaining the same. And that's when you'll see the arrows, basically, for all to see. But if you want to go deeper, that's what is going to be relevant. And of course, we could discuss particular countries or situations. They will all have their element. I see also a question about on the horizon on the side. I will take it now. The methodology is very much, the crisis group methodology. What we do is essentially qualitative. So as you know, we have analysts in or near areas of conflict who have access to actors in relation to the situation they cover. They do on a regular basis meetings, interviews with them. So they follow very closely actors' behavior. So that combined with the monthly tracking of Crisis Watch and where things are starting to move is basically the base for developing the on the horizon product, the combination of both. Yeah. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Isabel. There was a question from Vito as well for you, Sophia. I think if you can talk a bit more about the validity of disaggregated data collected from satellites and other sources.
Yes, so we basically used some of these satellite sources to do a little bit of drought and vegetation detection in some of the regions, because then you can just you can zoom into a specific polygon as you wish, but there is always like the cloud problems and maybe not as frequent monitoring of the situation, but then you kind of have to fill in the gaps, which we worked with another platform called Omdena, and they did some kind of like data, basically filling in those gaps, not dummy data, but a little bit generated data to fit maybe what was missing. It is promising in terms of creating historically something that doesn't exist, but it takes a lot of processing and also experts in image processing. So yeah, we collaborated with the University of Essex for this, and I think soon we're going to have something like a tool that will everyone would be able to access and download and do their own processing of images, because we found that the drought was something to look at for Somalia specifically. But going larger requires a lot of resources in satellite imagery.
Perfect. Then we also had a question from Bo. If we need more models product that can do scenario-based forecasting with qualitative analysis as inputs for these scenarios. I don't know, maybe if we can put that to you, Katayun, and if you have done any thoughts around sort of integration of qualitative analysis or data in your CAST system or other products.
Yeah, so I think that it's a really tricky thing to do. Obviously, one thing that we're trying to experiment with right now is sort of integrating the assessments or the sort of the idea of like a super forecasting kind of a model where we have information from our researchers, our analysts on their sort of prediction based on kind of the latent information coming out of the area on what they think might happen in the future. So if they're seeing, for example, increased rhetoric between rebel groups or something that they recognize from the past that has led to an increase in conflict, we have a method now for them to submit that to us sort of quantitatively as this is the area I'm looking at, this is the sort of prediction that I'm making and my level of confidence about it. And we can then try to integrate that into the forecast. It's relatively new, so I don't have much to tell you about whether it's working or not, but it's something that we're thinking about a lot, about how can we pick up on these kind of latent measures that aren't necessarily sort of existing in the data already.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I actually was on a presentation a couple of weeks ago where someone was presenting on an interesting platform for doing like expert forecasting system that developed, I think specifically on Libya, but with potential for scale. We have 1 minute left, and I'll just quickly address a question and then try to wrap it up. So there was a question from Mark Anthony Bauer on what the biggest challenges was in terms of scaling the model to different countries. I think in short, it's the availability of displacement data. Typically, we see that there's somewhat better data when it comes to cross-border movement, because the work of Sophia and her colleagues in UNHCR on registering people and collecting the data is really good. But when it comes to intern displacement, that's really a challenge, and that's sort of the main sort of gap we see when we try to develop these models for other countries. We're fortunate that we can rely on conflict data, which of course is the biggest predictor of displacement, where we can rely on timely data from ACLED. So that's sort of the main challenge, and also why I wanted to have Sophia here to give some of the insights and also on how you cover those gaps with some of these innovative data sources and approaches. So I think with that, I'll just wrap up. First of all, a big thank you to all of you that were here, and for all the good questions in the chat. I can see new questions and comments maybe coming in. And of course, a big thank you to all the speakers for great presentations, and generally, of course, the great work they're doing on a daily basis. I think my three sort of key takeaways from this today is really, I think first one is really around the context and the deep understanding of the context. I think the code story, as I like to highlight, of course, but also the example of Isabel that showed how you really need to read and understand the conflict trends and analysis, and see what are the small elements that can trigger changes, significant changes in the context. But also just the way, for example, the Katjun was showing how you, of course, also need to contextualize the forecast that you're doing to better understand it. I think the other key thing I took away was also sort of the need for these sort of more cross-disciplinary collaborative approaches to this space. I think also a key point from Seth. We of course have the importance of innovation and the use of innovative data sources, partnerships with private sector, but of course also we need, I mean, again, the climate shocks, they've been able to build on a lot of great work done in academia and science for many years on these models, whereas less maybe have been devoted to this on conflict and the subsequent impact. So we really need to also to bring in academia. We need to bring in the think tanks like International Crisis Group as well into this work if we are to advance it. And then I think the last point, which was mentioned by Seth and also echoed by Sophia, is really around the transparency on how these models are built, and transparency on how they're being used, and of course transparency on what impact do they then have when we then try to apply it to anticipatory action. And of course, always recognizing also the failures when they're there, and I'm sure there will be plenty here in the beginning. So with that, I will wrap up and say thank you all for coming, and I hope this was just the beginning of a great conversation around how we can really advance the anticipatory action agenda in conflict settings and on conflict-induced displacement. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.